name's Mercedes McCoy. How do you measure racial equality today? In this segment, we will be taking a look in measuring equality in political, economical, educational, and judicial standpoints for African Americans throughout history, concentrating on their toughest times up to today.
In 1819, slavery was first introduced to America by the Dutch to help with the tobacco production. Slaves were around one-third of the population in the South during the 18th century. However, some slaves were able to escape and make it to the North to be free. Yet they were not really free. From the brutal slavery down in the South to the horrid racism up in the North, African Americans were constantly hurt physically and verbally. The population never exceeded 1% in the northwestern states because the racism was so bad. The concept of black and white didn't come from Europe, but grew from America when slaves became free. Everyone was above black people, down to the poorest of the white folk. Before the 1800s, black men had more rights, like the right to vote and be on juries, but they slowly started to lose their rights with the high demand of slavery. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision declared that African Americans were not U.S. citizens, and that is when racism got worse. Black schools, churches, and orphanages were burnt down. Between 1820 and 1850, black men were the main targets for mob violence. They were hunted down and hung. City officials refused to protect black men from this and blamed them for inciting the violence with their uppity behavior. African Americans didn't sit back and watch, though. They built their own schools, churches, and orphanages again.
Wow, how insightful. Here's a look at Reconstruction.
1865 to 1877 was known as the Reconstruction era. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments allowed African Americans to vote, be part of the political process, gain land from owners, get a job, and use public accommodations. Even though this was true, the African Americans were not treated equally. In 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act. These acts divided the remaining Confederate states, all except Kentucky, into 5 military districts, requiring the states to accept the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution, granting freedom and political rights to blacks. However, Southern states passed black codes to restrict African American freedoms and force them to work for labor companies where they could only earn low wages. Throughout the Reconstruction era, there was also much violence towards African Americans that was caused by various individual groups with their own initiatives. Violence also befell people who informed African Americans of their newfound rights in politics. This had a major effect on Reconstruction era politics and brought great demoralization among the African American communities. After the Reconstruction era, African Americans' rights regressed. The Jim Crow laws began in 1876 and were not abolished until 1965. These laws were mainly abided by in the South. The Jim Crow laws were supposed to create separate but equal societies for black and white American citizens. Because of the Jim Crow laws, African Americans returned to be second-class citizens and stripped of their basic social, economic, and civil rights. In 1896, there was a famous Supreme Court trial, Plessy versus Ferguson, that challenged the legality of segregation. The courts ruled that having separate facilities for the races was constitutional, as long as they were equal. Even though the courts deemed these places as equal, they most certainly were not. The Caucasians were wealthier than African Americans, so they had much more money to put forth for their facilities. The African American educational system suffered a great amount from this, with fewer books and worse buildings. There were also many hate groups against the African American society. The most famous was the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK. This group was founded by 6 former Confederate soldiers in Pulaski, Tennessee. It started off as just a social gathering for the men. They would ride around disguised on horses after dark. They were surprised when they found out that this was causing fear, especially in former slaves, so they used this to their advantage. They began to rapidly expand, and they began to murder and beat up African Americans and Caucasians who had sympathy for them. During the 86 years that the KKK was prominent, 3,446 African Americans were lynched.
Now, let's take a look at civil rights.
The 1960s was a time where African Americans fought for their equality. They had many different types of protests. African Americans tried to fight for equal opportunity in employment, housing, education, right to vote, right of
equal access to public facilities, and right to be free of racial discrimination. They also accomplished to stop the Jim Crow system with their protests throughout the U.S. They were able to accomplish all of this with many leaders that made a difference, like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, Andrew Goodman, and many others. Many of these leaders risked their lives for change and equality. During this time, President Johnson tried to make things equal between everyone by creating new laws, but these laws did not help African Americans at all. The discrimination was worse in the South, but happened all over the country in every state. The civil rights movement in the South was one of the most significant and successful movements in American history. Most of the nonviolent protests and acts were during the 1950s, but it was not until the 1960s that it finally paid off. The Civil Rights Act, 1964, and the Voting Rights Act, 1965, was formed because of 4 black students sat down at a lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. That was only supposed to be for whites in February 1960. When they refused to leave, it caused chaos, and it led up to start movements which spread all over the country. There was a lot of violence during the 1960s. In 1963, 4 African American girls were killed because of a bombing in a Baptist church. And in 1968, Martin Luther King Jr., a very famous leader, was assassinated by a white man. Even with all of this violence and negativity, many black people still did violence-free protests and tried to not let this stop them in protesting what they believed in.
So we've looked into the past of how racism has affected African Americans widely throughout the U.S. But what about today? Does racism still continue?
Despite all efforts to gain racial equality, there still remains issues with racism today in the economical, educational, and judicial standpoints. For instance, the unemployment rate for African Americans is twice the unemployment for white people. Because of this, the median income for blacks is $33,321 compared to the median income of $57,009 for whites. When a male African American was born in 2001, it was estimated that they had a 32% chance of going to jail in their lifetime, while a white male only had a 6% chance of going to jail. In 2007, black people were 8 times more likely to commit a crime against a white person than a white person would commit a crime against a black person. After an arrest is made, African Americans are 33% more likely to be kept for questioning than whites. As of 2009, blacks were 21% more likely to have mandatory minimum sentences compared to whites, and 20% more likely to be imprisoned. In 2010, according to the U.S. Commission on Sentencing, found that blacks were faced a 10% longer sentencing compared to whites for the exact same crime. African Americans make up about 14% of regular drug users, but 37% of people arrested for drugs are African Americans. Because of all these arrests, about 13% of African American men are denied the right to vote. According to the Sentencing Project, 58% of African American juvenile youth are sent to adult prisons. It's estimated that 73% of all black kids born out of marriage drop out, use drugs, become unemployed, commit crimes, and are sent to jail many more times than whites. Even though the United States is closer than ever to equality, the fight for racial equality still exists today.
That concludes our special on African Americans and their struggle for equality. Racism still remains in America today, though we are pushing forward toward racial equality.